Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eve from Onkaparinga Libraries and I'm joined by Elijah from Neporendi Aboriginal Forum. We're so pleased to be kicking off our brand new series this evening called Southern Deadly Yarns. This is a new series of virtual author talks that really aims to highlight the incredible work of First Nations authors in Australia. We are incredibly thrilled to welcome groundbreaking writer and historian Bruce Pascoe as our very first guest. He zoomed in to join us all the way from his farm in rural Victoria. Hello, Bruce.
How are you going?
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, a little intro to Bruce, not that he really needs it. His book, Dark Emu, was a massive success. It deconstructs the history of Aboriginal people that we've always been told. His research found that Aboriginal people were not hunter-gatherers, but actually ran complex societies rooted in productive agricultural practices. Marsha Langton even called Dark Emu the most important book on Australia. So high praise.
That is pretty awesome. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. My name's Elijah. Thanks again, Eve, for making all these things happen.
Teamwork.
It's a bit of a team. Yeah. We're here on the lands of the Kaurna people. As an Arabana person, it's important that we acknowledge that the country that we're on is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. In particular, this area, Aldinga, takes its name from Aldinga, which means yabby. So this was the place for the, great place for freshwater yabbies. It was the place to go for the best yabbies around town. Unfortunately now, though, most of the land's been drained. Those swamps are no longer there. But, we do have, this old place, and there are some places just down the road, not far from here, that still do hold a lot of water, still hold a lot of ecological importance and that cultural importance as well. So we'd like to acknowledge that the Kaurna people, the traditional land to the Kaurna people, it's still as important today as it ever has been, and their connection has survived all through this time. Now, Bruce, you mentioned that you were just on your tractor a moment ago. Have you been keeping busy throughout all this sort of COVID time?
We've got 4 or 5 Yuin people and some non-Aboriginal people working on the farm. So we've got a bit going on. We've got 2 buildings we're working on as well as our plant production. And but it's been very wet, and so some of our tracks became a bit impassable. So I was supposed to do this job yesterday, but it was too wet. So I started it this morning, and we're trying to consolidate the roads so people aren't getting bogged, which is pretty important when you're trying to get work done. So there's a really practical grunt side to the farm, as well as the exciting part of actually growing plants that our old people used to grow. That's the fascinating bit, but there's a lot of infrastructure and just plain hard work that has to be done as well.
Thanks again for making the time this evening. I'm always amazed at your skillful craft of words. Just to mention salt as well, and I've got a bit of a background in environmental science, and for me to feel compassion to a fox, I think you worded that incredibly well. I mean, got me right here, and I don't usually get that for sort of pests, plants and animals, that kind of thing. So congratulations. Also, congratulations on all the great work that's come out of Dark Emu. It's really opened up this almost like a Pandora's box, as you will. I mean, there's been a lot of stories coming out from here, there and everywhere. I was in Darwin recently, and there was old oral stories of people growing rice, and like rice paddies up in the north, and you know they tried in the 50s to grow it and they weren't successful. But you know, generations ago, this had happened in Australia. So it's amazing that we've now got a platform for that. And I'm not too sure if any other writers are doing that kind of important work that you've been doing now. I remember you saying a few years ago when we were up in Darwin for the native title conference, is that not many people were doing this work, and you felt almost compelled to do it, even though you do write fiction as well. What really drew you into that area of saying, look, I've got to write this book, this Dark Emu book?
Well, obviously, Australia's refusal to acknowledge the real history of the country was part of that. But when I was looking for my own family and the various branches of that family, I was assisted by Aboriginal community, you know, individuals and community in general. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. So, you know, you become responsible. You can't just ask for information. You then become responsible for the information. So I was then taught a different history of the country than I learned at school. And shamefully, I was already an adult when I was taught the real history of the country, and by, you know, a dozen or so Aboriginal elders, most of whom are now dead. But it meant that I was so shocked by it, I had to go back to other members of the community, but also to libraries. And so that early work I did, and that we're talking about the 80s and 90s, that was the foundation for a book called Convincing Ground. And the research for Convincing Ground became the start of Dark Emu. So I was drawn into it, not by my education, but my lack of education. And those people who were generous enough to forgive my ignorance and dedicate themselves to relieving it. So I felt like it wasn't of my own volition that these books got written. It was because I was placed in that position by the Aboriginal community. I had a wonderful mentor, and a lady called Auntie Bunter, who read nearly everything I wrote, and she encouraged me to keep going, because sometimes in the Aboriginal community, if you look like you're too close to European education, some people find that an insult. Auntie Bunter never did, and she just encouraged me to keep on going. And she gave me the confidence to know that our old people spoke 7 or 8 languages. You know, we were language masters, and you know, so we shouldn't be ashamed of using big words now, because in the past we used big words in 7 or 8 languages. You know, a word like Onkaparinga is a very big word and has an enormous meaning. So we shouldn't be ashamed of using big words. And I go into a lot of schools and I tell the kids that all the time. I deliberately use words that I know will challenge them, but I'm not trying to insult them, and I'm not trying to show off. What I'm trying to do is speak to them like their elders would have spoken to them, made things difficult for them, made things complex, because that's what the law is. The law is incredibly complex, and the students of the law L-O-R-E, are not given an easy road. It's made difficult so that they will have to work hard. And this is something that I think Australia has no idea about, the fact that these lessons are still going on and how difficult they are and how philosophic are the messages in those lessons.
Yeah, they often don't come easy. There's just those breadcrumbs that you need to follow. Neve, did you have a...
Yeah, so when you were writing, Bruce, when you were writing Dark Emu, Bruce, what was the number one thing that bowled you over, that surprised you in your research?
I think the thing that shocked me most was that I had been doing some conversations with, Australian history students, and then a group of lecturers took me aside, invited me to have a cup of tea with them and a piece of cake, and it was all very civilised. And they said to me, "Look, we don't want you to come back, because you're talking about Aboriginal agriculture, and it didn't happen, Brucey. It was they're hunters and gatherers, and that's all. And my mother taught me to be polite, and I tried to be, but I was furious. I was sweating with frustration and the insult of it all. As an Aboriginal man, I thought, how far are these people from the acceptance of scholarship? And so what it told me was that if I was going to tell this story to Australia, then if I couldn't convince some of the best educated Australians in the land, then I would have to use material that most Australians find palatable. And that led me to the explorers, because the explorers are like Bradman and Mother Teresa and the stump jump plough. All Australians love them. And so I knew that if I could find material in the explorers' journals, and I knew I would, because in the research of people like Rupert Gerritsen and Bill Gamage, I'd already seen these threads, but I hadn't really followed them through. So as I left that meeting, I headed out of Canberra, and I was looking for a second-hand bookshop. And the first one I came to, I went into it determined to buy any book of Australian history I could find. And the one I did find was Sir Thomas Mitchell's Journeys into Tropical Australia. And I think about page 86 or something like that, I came across the description of Mitchell, in his own words, riding through 9 miles of stacked grain. And, the fact that this grain had been harvested and stacked and that there were 9 miles of it should have been manna from heaven for any historian. Thousands of historians and educators read that passage. None of them included it in the history of Australia that our children learnt. So it's a deliberate omission. You can't pretend that it wasn't deliberate, because an historian should have danced with glee reading those words, because they then knew that they could walk into any classroom or any tutorial and tell people some really exciting things about their country, but they did not. They refused to reveal to Australia that Aboriginal people were growing grain and harvesting it and converting it into flour. It's shocking to think about it. If you think of the degree of obfuscation and manipulation of the facts of history, it's like Nazi Germany. The propaganda that has been peddled as Australian history was shocking. It still shocks me now, and I'm not trying to overrate it. What I'm trying to do is express my shock that really, really well-educated Australians would have read those passages and found them not interesting for Australian history students. It's deliberate mismanagement of history, deliberate hiding of the facts. And if we are now starting to examine those facts, then it's not before time. The thing that excites me is that the people who are most interested in these things, it seems to me, are all young. They're far more on top of these ideas. They seem, to me, to be far more interested in the health of the world. And they seem to me, from my conversations and the correspondence I get, to be far more interested in the history of their country and what it represents, what a history like that might represent for them, what it might mean for their lives to have this incredible history. You know, we're talking 120,000 years minimum now, because the excavation at Moyil down near Warrnambool, Point Ritchie's its other name, has come up with an age of 120,000 years. And there are some people who are beside themselves with anger and frustration that we're talking about these ages. You know, there's all these excuses about why this is wrong. You know, the science is wrong, the method is wrong. But really, it's been examined again and again, and the same figures come up. It actually started out at 80,000 years. They re-examined it, came up with 100,000 years. They did tests on a midden 100 metres away, and it came up with 120,000 years. This is irrefutable now. And to be trying to resist this information is an element of racism. You know, I might be wrong, but explain it to me. Explain why people are resisting information of such credibility by such eminent scientists. Why would you resist it? What's the point? Because you don't want a sophisticated Aboriginal culture. Don't want that because you don't want people to investigate the stolen land. Bloody nonsense.
Yeah, there does seem to be some overwhelming boneheadedness sometimes in this country. Jiminy Crickets, you've covered a lot of ground there, and I could just listen to you speak for a lot longer. Just incidentally, I mean, we don't seem to be that good at promoting our own foods. I mean, once upon a time, I think we did out of basic necessity, and then we thought, oh, well, we've got all these other grains and crops and they're somehow superior. I think that's beginning to unfold now. And I mean, it took the Americans to develop the macadamia nut. We just don't seem to have that sort of intellect to take something and develop it. I think
racism. I think we refuse Aboriginal provenance because it talks about occupation of the land, land use, utility, sustainability. That's what it talks about. So to use Aboriginal foods in the past was resisted simply because it flew in the face of the colonial theory. The colonial theory was that Aboriginal people were hopeless and did nothing with the land. That is why, the government introduced laws like terra nullius to prove that Aboriginal people were incompetent and therefore explain to a Christian population that there was nothing to see here. Nothing is wrong. You know, everybody knew that Aboriginal people were being killed and that the land was stolen, but because Christians could prove that Aboriginal people were savages, it was okay. You've wound me up now.
I have, and we've only just started. Jeez. But I often tend to reflect too. There was a German philosopher, gang somebody or other, and he'd always talk about how you should treat somebody, and not so much treat them as what you see today, but treat them as their potential, their full potential. And I think a lot of the times we've done the opposite in this country. We've really dulled things down, we've dumbed things down, and people have started to believe that and act like it. So hopefully through your work, people will actually start to believe, have confidence within themselves and think, no, hang on a minute here, you know, just because somebody told me that I'm worthless, that doesn't make it right. And I can go out there and I can do things, and I can do things in a positive.
Our kids are being told that they'll never finish school. And, you know, when you're told that, you know that the teacher thinks you're bloody stupid. So you don't finish school. What we need is teachers who tell Aboriginal kids, you are as smart as anyone else. You know, they stopped measuring our heads in 1880 because they found that the Aboriginal brain pan was bigger than the European brain pan. They stopped the research immediately because, you know, even they could see they were going to be made to look like donkeys. The purpose of measuring heads was to find that the European head was superior. And, you know, the European head is, the brain pan slightly smaller than Aboriginal brain pan. So bad luck, bit of bad science there, or you chose the wrong subject. So then, you know, all sorts of other things were tried, you know, and we're still being told that genetically we're incapable of absorbing alcohol, which is, you know, medically stupid and nonsense. But anything to show that Aboriginal people are inferior. We've got to tell our kids that's why there's a young Dark Emu, so that our Aboriginal kids can read that in
read it
and feel proud. Good on you, Eve. That's well done. You know, one of the reasons why I wanted a kid's version of the book from day one, and it was reinforced to me over in WA when I went into a school, and I was a bit early to do a talk with the kids, and so I wandered through the library, which I always like to do anyway. And so I went to the history section, and I looked up and down the shelves, and I thought I must have got it wrong. So I, you know, went back to the little panel that shows you where everything is stored, and no, I was in the right aisle. Not one book on Aboriginal history. Not one book. You know, all the stuff on gold and wool and war and all of that stuff, not one on Aboriginal history. And I thought then, what about the 14-year-old girl who's given an assignment in history and decides, because I've known kids like this at that age who've decided to stick up for their own people. So I'm going to write an essay on my own history. And she goes to the library to
Whoops, I think we might have lost you there for a second, Bruce.
about her family. How devastating is that? And I bet you that a lot of those 14-year-old girls leave school as a result, because they know they're not wanted. And it was a startling example to me. It's not the first time it happened, but it happened at a very important time, because it was when we were starting to build the book, Young Dark Emu, and there were some terrific school teachers and researchers who worked on that. And, you know, the design of it, I think is pretty extraordinary. And it was designed by educators. I'm an ex-school teacher too, but it was designed by educators who had been involved in the national curriculum. And the purpose of it was to make a book of inquiry. Not tell kids, you know, what they had to know, but to make kids go back to the sources and investigate it. You know, and there's a lot of nonsense being spoken about the credibility of Dark Emu and Young Dark Emu and you know, the fact that the sources are twisted. But this whole thing is designed so that kids have to go back to the original documents. They have to explore those things. And, you know, I think that's really good education, that the kids have to be involved in the detective work for their own history. And if Aboriginal kids do that, then I think we've had a real victory. And if non-Aboriginal kids sitting next to them have to read the same book and explore the same journey, then I think all Australians have won, and that we will be a more mature and intelligent nation. When you start dumbing down education, it becomes, if you're trying to hide something, then you simplify things and dumb it down, and then you're educating a dumb population. You know, that doesn't always work because there's always escapees. But if you're dumbing down the education, then you create a stupid country. Donald Trump is doing a magnificent job of this in America now, because he hates science, he hates facts, he hates those people who study these facts. And so gradually, the information becomes stupid. And people lap it up because it reinforces their own racism, their own attack on minorities. The trouble in America today is that the minorities are 50% of the population. And, you know, and the same is going to happen in Australia, that the people that those old white men want to hate will soon be the majority. Those old professors and those old politicians and those old journalists won't be here soon, and I won't be here with them. But there'll be 1 million kids who will be exploring their history. And as soon as they do that, and they understand that Aboriginal Australia is the oldest civilization on Earth, and most probably invented the transport, invented harvests, certainly invented bread, and the first image of the human face in history, the first image of a plant on its own for botanical reasons. All of these things, when our kids, whether they're black or white, understand this, they'll fall in love with their country, and they'll say with pride, my culture is 120,000 years. Doesn't matter whether they're Japanese, you know, white bread Australian, Korean, Chinese. Those kids will say, I live in the country that invented government. Because if you're 120,000 years ago and you start organising agriculture and laws, you've invented society. And I'm going to a place in New South Wales in a few weeks' time, COVID willing, and I'm going to be standing beside what I think is the oldest village on Earth. So if you go to the oldest village on Earth, the people who organised that village, they invented society. It was them who decided that we're going to build our house next to this other mob, and another mob's going to build their house next to them. That's the invention of society. And when you invent society, you've got to have rules. That's government. When our kids, black or white, in this country, understand that government was invented here, you've got to have pride. So all this other stuff that's going on, this nonsense, is designed to keep our people stupid and to keep black people down. So I think these are really exciting days. You know, Malcolm Turnbull didn't get much right, but he did say it was an exciting time to be an Australian. And I think he's right. He wasn't referring to this, but I think it is an exciting time to be an Australian. And it's an exciting, really exciting time to be a black kid at school. And, you know, if there are parents of kids listening, or kids themselves listening to this broadcast, please stay at school. We need you. And if there are white kids there who love their country and want to learn as much about their country as they can, please stay at school and defy those who will tell you lies.
Bruce, what amazing words, but I promise you that libraries have come absolutely a long way since then. And I think your book's had a lot to do with it. We absolutely cannot keep this book on the shelves. Hundreds of copies in South Australia, and the wait list is still enormous. So I think you've led the way in a change for libraries, for sure.
Well, thanks for that. Young Dark Emu just won the Booksellers Award and that is the award for the book that they like to sell themselves. So that this Young Dark Emu was the book that they loved selling over the counter, and so booksellers are in that position as well. I think Australia is on the brink of changing its mind, and it relies on people like Tracker Tillmouth, Marcia Langton, Stan Grant, but all the other old heroes, Udguru, Jack Davis, I was talking about today. Jack Davis's granddaughter is struggling to get enough money to stay at school. It's 2020, guys. You've got a kid here who's brilliant. I've got one of her paintings hanging up in my lounge room. You've got this brilliant kid. She's so smart. She's 12 years old. She plays football. She is one of the students you'd love to have in your school, and we can't get a scholarship for her.
Wow.
That's what I got on the tractor, was trying to rake up some money to keep this kid at school.
Well, a lot of people have written in actually and said, well, how do we contribute to something that they're, respectful of you giving your time? And they were wondering, how do we repay that favour? And some people have suggested, look, is there a charity or is there something?
The Aboriginal woman who's looking after this young girl, because she's unfortunately not able to live with her family. And if people want to help, send me the emails. I'll forward them on to that household, and I'm sure it will make an enormous difference. It'll make an enormous difference to her, because what it will say is, Australia loves me.
All right, we'll make sure we'll do that, and we'll follow up with those people who we've invited tonight. And then, if people want to pay you back, then I guess that's a good way to do that too. Also, we do hear this word superfood being thrown around a lot, and I'm not much of a believer in superfoods, but I do believe we have some of the most nutritional valued foods in the world right here. What sort of, I get a bit hesitant because there's not a lot of Aboriginal people in these fields of, they don't have the capital, they don't have the business models. Quite often you'll see a lot of these things get exploited time and time again. Have you come across many good examples of, good ethical practices, particularly when it comes to native bush foods?
No. No. There's very ethical. There's a lot of money being spent on Aboriginal foods. Everyone's gone mad on rosella and bush tomato and lemon myrtle and all of this stuff. 1% of that money spent goes to Aboriginal people. 1%. We don't need to talk to a government for very long. What we need to say to them is 1%, you explain it to me. You're a white politician. You explain to me how 1% of the money spent on Aboriginal food goes to Aboriginal people. Just explain it to me. We don't have to say anything to it. You explain that, and if you can, and of course they can't, then they have to do something about it. Because it's, how come our life expectancy is, you know, so much lower than other people. Explain it to me. You know, when the intervention took place and, you know, they took in the army, things like that. Explain to me, Prime Minister, why you didn't send in the doctors and nurses and the school teachers. Why did you send in the army? Explain to me, Prime Minister, that in Maningrida, 30 brand new houses were built and remained empty because those 30 houses were for policemen, school teachers and nurses who were fly in, fly out. They were brand new. The plastic was still on the furniture. They were never lived in. And yet in the town, there were still 30 people living in a house, and, you know, in one of them, where one of the people that I was working with there, you could see the sky through the roof. Now, it is a good climate, but when it rains there, and you don't want holes in your roof. And yet, all those new houses that were created in the intervention, hardly any of them went to Aboriginal people. Explain that. You know, like, this is what Australia doesn't do. Like, all that information is in Hansard. It's in the official documents of the Australian Parliament. The fact that all these houses were built and a fraction of them went to Aboriginal people. And Australia is blithely talking about, you know, how the intervention was necessary because of the sacred little children. Well, no one has been convicted of any of the crimes that were suggested, but Aboriginal people still didn't get houses. Explain it to me, Prime Minister. You know, I'm not here to cut you down. I'm not going to talk about this publicly and shame you, but as one person to another person, one Australian to another Australian, explain it to me. Explain why that is fair. Explain how it happened. Tell me, how did that happen? That all those brand new houses are empty and our people are living in slums. Just explain it to me. You know, that's what we've got to say to our politicians. You've got to ring your local member. You know, the Northern Territory had an election yesterday, but you've got to ring your local politician and not be angry. Just say, look, you know, I've heard that this has happened. How did it happen like that? You know, surely you can see that this is wrong. You know, you're a Christian white man. You can see that it's wrong. How did it happen? This is what Australia's got to do. And I think Australia's doing it. You know, I think ever since, you know, I mentioned a few names before, but when Stan Grant went on TV, primetime TV, and started talking about these things, Australia began to listen more avidly than they had listened in the past. And of course, Stan was standing on the shoulders of people like Marcia, people like Jack Davis, Udguru, you know, Mum Shirl, all those wonderful people, Essie Coffey, all those brilliant people. But the timing seems to be right now. And I think it's because it's the new generation of people. I know there are people of my generation who are sympathetic, but sympathy is ineffectual without action. And the fact that nothing has happened shows how ineffectual that was. So now that we are starting to get somewhere, it means that there's a different generation listening, and that generation is having more impact than the previous ones. And I'm not trying to dismiss those gallant people, those gallant non-Aboriginal people in their 60s and 70s who worked so hard, you know, people like Nugget Coombs. But we weren't successful. So now the young generation is making headway. And, you know, I knew this was going to happen 10 years ago when I was talking to young Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students at universities. I could see this incredible army of young people, all knowledged up and ready to go. And I thought, Australia's not going to be able to resist this. You know, Australia might be, you know, still able to hide behind Barnaby Joyce and stuff like that, but it's not going to last. It can't last because there's a tsunami of young intelligence, and it's just going to happen.
Yeah, there does seem to be that tide rising again, and hopefully this will be the time it permeates over and breaks that threshold. There really does seem to be a lot of interest out there, and you know, we can't wait for another generation. I think, you know, it's going to be now or never for this planet. What we might also do is cut to a bit of a Q&A. So if people wanted to write through on the webinar chat, feel free to write some questions in through to us. We also talked a little bit about your book, Found. It's simple, but I think anybody who's anybody will understand the meaning behind it and what it can mean for people. Would you be happy to do a little reading for us?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Found, but it's important to know that it was illustrated by Charmaine Ledden-Lewis, and this was, I wrote the book for Mugabala Books so that we could set up a competition called the Keston Award for a new book illustrator, a new Aboriginal book illustrator. So the book was the lure to create a new book illustrator, which has happened, and Charmaine is brilliant. But the origins of the book were actually off this farm, because when I took over the farm 2 years ago, the previous owner was not a particularly kind man, and so animals were being killed and damaged and mistreated all over the joint. But a calf jumped out of a stock crate and got away, and remained on the farm. That bloke was going to shoot it, and I begged him to leave it alone. I would look after it. And I had to do this for a number of animals, including dogs. But so this calf was in my paddock with a couple of the horses that I'd also saved from that grizzly death. And I just watched it, you know, trying to associate with the horses, and you know, they're both animals have got hooves, but it just wasn't working. The calf didn't want to be a horse. It wanted to be a calf. It wanted to be with its mother and its brothers and sisters. It didn't want to be anything else. So I watched it for, you know, a year and more. And eventually my neighbour's cattle broke into my farm. And so I was able to release the calf with those other cows. And that was the genesis of this story. So it's called Found, and it begins, I'm all alone. I want my mother and sisters and brothers, but they're all gone. I can see some horses and some wood ducks and a man. The man pushed us all into the back of a truck. I jumped and flew through the air and ran. The man had stolen my mother. Now the man's gone, and so is my family. I want my mother and sisters and brothers. I'm all alone. I ran to the river. I can see some horses. They're not my family, but they're here. I go over to them. They're not my family, but they have hooves and fur. Moo, moo. I hear someone. I charge down the hill. but I don't see my family. More, more. I can hear my mother. And she calls out for me. I call out for her. More, more. I hear her over the river. More. I see my mother. She calls out for me again. I race over the river and she trots up. She smells my breath and licks my neck. I have found my mother. Now I am home with my family.
Such a beautiful book. And your sound effects just make it, Bruce.
Sorry?
Nothing better than a book read by the author.
Well, nothing better than a book that is real.
True. Now, we might throw to a bit of a Q&A from the audience now. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask Bruce, we'll pick out a couple, pop them into the Q&A chat. Let's have a look. Someone wants to know if Young Dark Emu has been translated into any Aboriginal languages and what kind of challenges this process would bring up, if any.
No, it hasn't. That's an interesting question, but it hasn't been translated into any Aboriginal languages. It's been translated into French and German, but not Aboriginal languages. That's an interesting point to make and to try and resolve. I'm on Yuin country here, which is I'm in Victoria, but it's south coast New South Wales. Our lands go from these rivers, the Wallagara, the Ginor, and the Maramingo, the salt rivers, which I actually refer to in my collection of stories, Salt. But I'm on Yuin country here, and even though we've put a lot of work into our language, there are not too many people who speak Yuin very well. And the question is really, really interesting because what are we doing if we're not translating these books into the languages of our people?
No, I agree wholeheartedly, and to be able to connect people with their languages, it only makes storytelling and that story much stronger. We did have somebody write in as well. Dear Bruce, thanks so much for your work. Their question talks about, well, you being a teacher, you know, a lot of people want to embed Indigenous knowledges across the curriculum, but get paralysed. They don't know where to start. They don't know if they're going to upset people. They just get stopped in their tracks. What would you say to some of those teachers out there?
Be brave. You can't make a mistake. Be brave. And I beg the patience of the communities that if a teacher makes a mistake, it is better to try than to pretend that they're so fearful that they can't teach Aboriginal studies to our kids. If you're a decent teacher, let the kids teach you. You know, ask the kids. Don't say to the kids, did you eat witchetty grubs for breakfast this morning? Don't say, is your father an alcoholic? Don't say, were you molested as a child? Say to the kids, what was your grandfather's name? Tell me the story of that name. Because if you ask a child and get that name of that person, you will find that those people, those surnames are recorded in our history. And those surnames have incredible stories. There's a man works on this farm and his name is Mumbala. And he's got mountains and ranges and rivers and towns named after him because he was such a great man. And so when we did the first harvest of our grain here, it was Terry Mumbala who harvested it. That was an enormously important moment in Australian history. Of course, there were only 3 of us here to watch it, but it was one of those really important moments, and it was kind of accidental that Terry was on the tractor. It wasn't planned like that, but because we were so busy with this harvest that we'd never done before, that we were just watching it. But when the tractor got going and the harvest went well and the grain was going into the bin, we were able to stand back, and Sally and I just looked at each other and said, of course, it's got to be Terry. You know, had to be Terry.
Kangaroo grass, was it? Was that the kangaroo grass?
We call it Mamajan Naluk, which it translates as dancing grass, because that's what the grass does in the wind. It has this beautiful movement, and we've called it by the Aboriginal name so that we don't get it stolen from us. Everybody knows what it is. You know, it's one of the common grasses of East Gippsland. Most farms have it on there, but when we harvested that day in April this year, and then converted it into flour the next day and baked bread from it, it was the first time in 250 years that had been done. And, you know, we were very conscious of it all. You know, we ate that bread like it was a sacrament, because we were so conscious of the importance of it. But yeah, we're trying to hide it so that, you know, big industrial agriculture doesn't steal it from us. It's a shame to have to do that, but that's the nature of capitalism. And you know, I think people are going to be all over it shortly, but it just gives us this breathing space for us to get our handle on the method of converting it into flour, making the recipes for the bread, etc. Because one of the most shocking things that's happened in recent years in Australia was when the Queen's Council, who decided on the Yorta Yorta native title claim, said, "Oh well, look, I'm sorry, but your native title right has been washed away by the tide of history." Because, you know, it was his claim that Aboriginal people weren't still involved in their culture, despite the fact that, you know, one of my brothers up there still makes stone axes, and I've got one of them in my lounge room that he gave me, you know, washed away by the tide of history. Tell Brendan that. You know, so that really struck me, that phrase, washed away by the tide of history. And when we started the farm, who wants it? We're not going to sell it to Aboriginal people, we'll give it away. People, because we want our people to be involved in this industry, and we don't want to give any lawyer any opportunity to say that our history has been washed away. Those days are over, Australia.
Well, we tend to be losing you on the bandwidth, but I got to admit,
Generator is about to run out of petrol. That's what's going on. But as soon as it dies, we'll be right. Because solar power, I've had to boost it because we're building a building outside, and we've been using a nail gun, which has been soaking up our juice.
Oh, right. Well, we'll wrap up in a minute then. I just wanted to say a quick thank you for the book. What you wrote in here helped inspire me to create a short film. My mother's people, Arabana people, you have one of our wells in your book, and that really inspired me to go out and create like a story about the Unadata Track being a really old Silk Road. Have you had many other people sort of feed back to you to say, thank you, Bruce, and you've inspired me to do something else? Like,
yeah, look, I don't want to, you know, this is not a brag. What it is, it's pride in Aboriginal people that we are so involved in our culture, and we're so passionate about our history that so many Aboriginal people have read Dark Emu and have responded to me that it's given them a little bit of a boost and a little bit of lever on their local government and their local school. So to that extent, I'm really proud. But a lot of non-Aboriginal people have read it too and have responded in the same way. And, you know, it's the timing. It's not my genius, because I know I'm not a genius. If I was a genius, my life would have been a lot easier, but I'm not, you know. And so it was just those old people who showed the patience to take me by the hand and said, look, you're a stupid young man. You might be a university graduate, but you don't know anything about Australian history. You've come to me asking about your family. Well, I'm not going to tell you about your family until you've learned Australian history, because your family were deep in the guts of Australian history, and it's a bloody shame you don't know it. But now you're going to have to listen to me. And so those people over years and years, just kept on drip feeding me with information. I didn't realise there was a war for the land in Australia. That's how stupid I was. And I was a qualified history teacher. I didn't realise there was a war for the land in Australia. And those old people, and it was around the time of the Broad Arrow massacre in Tasmania. And we were all watching the television one night, and there was deadly silence in the room because the journalist was saying, this is the worst massacre in Australia's history. And one of the old people turned around to me and said, it wasn't even the worst massacre there on Eagle Hawk Neck, because there'd been far worse massacres there. And Australia is so ignorant of its history, it comes up with stupid phrases like that. It goes on and on and on and on. You know, every time there's, multiple deaths anywhere, it's the biggest loss of life in that town. Australia, learn your history.
Wow, I think we'd better wrap it up. I can see that Bruce has got his dinner there, hand delivered. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I think you've moved everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And to feel that passion and that fire burning still, it's good to see. And
blame my grandmother. You reckon I've got to watch out for her?
All right.
Rip your own.
Well, thank you again, Bruce. We can't thank you enough. Now, this is just the first of a series of 5 Southern Deadly Yarns, so be sure to visit our Eventbrite and Facebook pages and book in for the next one, which is next week with Dr. Anita Heiss to celebrate Indigenous Literacy Day, which we're very excited about. I'll send you out an email with some feedback after some feedback tomorrow. We really rely on everyone's feedback to keep delivering great events like this one, so please take the few minutes just to fill it out for us. And we've recorded the session today too, and it will be on our website from tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, Bruce. It's been an honour.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.